Welcome on back to the GSMC Football Podcast, everybody. My name is Matthew Quinn. I am, of course, your host for the evening. And once again, we are also always brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I want to thank you guys all for joining me today. And I want to also just offer a quick apology for those of you who were expecting a show last night. We had some technical difficulties that I ran into, and I was unable to record a show last night. So I apologize for anyone who was looking forward to that show, but we're going to go ahead and do the show that we were planning on doing last night here tonight. So we do have a great show for you today. We'll be covering a number of things, first of which we're going to dive into a little bit of news in terms of Stefon Diggs signing with the Patriots a couple days ago. We didn't really get a chance to talk about that much, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that. And we're also going to dive into some top 5 rankings of both running backs and edge rushers. And also make sure that you stick around for later in the show for our College Corner segment. And I'm going to be doing a season preview of the Florida Gators football season coming up in just a few short months. So before we go ahead and get started on everything, as always, like I always do, I just want to ask that you guys like and follow the show. If you do have a question during the show, just go ahead and type that into the super chat, and then your voice can be heard whenever you type in that question. So always, if you've got a question, I absolutely encourage you to do that. Your input is a big part of what makes this show great. We thrive on your energy and your insights. Whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make absolutely sure your message stands out and gets featured on this show, there's an easy way to do that. Use the super chat feature. Just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content that you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show interactive and exciting. And if you prefer, you can also go to gsmcsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support, and we're so thankful to have you as part of our community. So again, the link is gsmcpodcast.net for those of you who want to hit up the super chat during the show. So let's go ahead and get started on our first segment of the day. We're going to be doing some NFL superlatives. But before we do get into that, I just want to quickly touch on the Stefon Diggs acquisition that the Patriots were able to do just a couple days ago. It's a 3-year deal, $69 million max deal that it is worth. I think that's a good move for the Patriots. I'm not crazy about the contract because coming off of an ACL for Stefon Diggs, and obviously he's a little bit older. He's still relatively in that prime segment, but he's probably on the back end of that prime. Also with the torn ACL, that does raise some questions as well. But the Patriots were pretty much hurting at wide receiver for a good number of years since Brady left. So I think this acquisition of Stefon Diggs definitely improves that room for sure. But whether or not it will lead to, them possibly getting, to the playoffs or something like that, that's a whole other story. But I like the move overall because I like what the Patriots are doing this offseason. I think they've really impressed, if all the way from their head coach. Getting Mike Vrabel, I think, is a great fit. Obviously, he played there for a number of years. So it's a great fit. He knows the organization, pretty well. So a lot of trust is there in the locker room with Mike Vrabel. And obviously he brought back Josh McDaniels as the offensive coordinator, which will greatly help Drake May. And McDaniels was the offensive coordinator for a good chunk of when Tom Brady was the quarterback, and Brady got along really well with him. And he has been known as a very good offensive mind. Hasn't had the best success as a head coach, but as a coordinator, he has always been very good. So I like what the Patriots are doing there. Obviously, they went and got Milton Williams from Philadelphia, so that's a good move too. And then getting Carlton Davis from the Lions to shore up that secondary a little bit. And they've still got Christian Gonzalez, the young corner there. So, that's going to be a pretty good secondary. Their defense was pretty solid last year, despite the fact that they didn't have a great overall year. Their defense usually is the strong point. And with Mike Vrabel being their head coach now, I don't think that will change much. I think the Patriots are going to be much better this year than they were last year. Whether or not they make the playoffs, like I said, that's kind of a whole other story, but I like what they're doing in the offseason so far, so I would expect an improved year out of the Patriots going forward. So that's my thoughts on the Stefon Diggs acquisition. So let's go ahead and get into the actual meat of the bones here. When we're talking about the first segment of the show, we're going to do our NFL superlatives, and we're going to start. And for those of you who don't know or are unfamiliar with superlatives, it's basically just players, coaches, situations that are most likely to, fill in the blank or whatever. So those are what they're all posed as. So as for an example, the first one that I have here is most likely to go 9-8 or 10-7 and get blown out of the playoffs. That would be the Pittsburgh Steelers and Mike Tomlin. I put that there as most likely because that just seems to be the case with the Steelers. That just seems to be what always happens under Mike Tomlin in recent years, and their just seemingly crazy desire to get Aaron Rodgers this offseason is not going to do anything to change that narrative. I think it's going to be a 9-8, 10-7 year if they're lucky, and then they get to the playoffs and then get blown out in the first round. The other day, when I was going through records and things of that nature, I had the Steelers finishing like 7-10 and getting their first their first losing season under Mike Tomlin. I still think that's a strong possibility, but I also think it's a strong possibility that they can get to 9-8 or 10-7 because that's just kind of what Mike Tomlin does overall. So I really don't really like what the Steelers are doing, and we're going to get into that a little bit in our mailbag section later on, but because there's some questions that are referring to that. But I don't like what I'm seeing from the Steelers so far, and that's why I have this as one of my superlatives. So moving on to the next part here, and excuse me, most likely to win Rookie of the Year. I have running back out of Boise State, Ashton Jeanty. And that's mainly because he is the best running back coming out of the draft next month. And I think he's going to end up going to the Raiders, who are all of a sudden building a pretty solid team there with Pete Carroll and then Geno Smith as the quarterback there. And they desperately need a running back, and he is going to be an improvement over Alexander Mattison, who just got right around 400 yards rushing, and he was their leading rusher last year. So I think Ashton Jeanty will be a massive upgrade if they decide to go that route in the draft, which I think they will. A lot of people are kind of betting on the Raiders to pick up Ashton Jeanty. So a lot of people are going to want him if he's available, but I think the Raiders are the most likely fit, at their current position in the draft. So I like Ashton Jeanty. What he did last year at Boise State was, nothing short of spectacular. He had 26 touchdowns, over 2,000 yards rushing. He was very, very good, and he was in the runnings for Heisman. Didn't win it, of course, but he was right up there as, one of the best players in college football last year. And I think he has shown massive improvement over those 3 years that he was in college. Obviously, his first year at Boise, he didn't get a ton of carries. His next year, he was a little more productive, but not really where he wanted to be. And then, of course, his final season, he was, lights out and a Heisman finalist. So he was very, very good, and I think that'll continue in all of a sudden a much better running back situation in Vegas if they were to get him. They suddenly have a pretty solid looking offense there. Maybe get a couple of other players to pair with Jacoby Myers, and maybe they can be pretty good. I don't know. We'll see. I had them going to the playoffs, sneaking in as the third team in that division to get to the playoffs next year. So we'll see if that comes to pass. But that's the other one that I have. The next one on this list here is I have most likely coach to win Coach of the Year, and I think this kind of all boils down to what I was talking about in our last show when I was talking about bold predictions and, doing things of that nature. I have Ben Johnson, the coach of the Bears, being most likely to win Coach of the Year, just because there's been a lot of, publicity around the Bears with everything that they've been doing in the offseason, and I think they're setting themselves up to have a very good season. And Ben Johnson, obviously, his first year as a head coach, being the offensive coordinator for a number of years in Detroit and getting some very, very good success while he was there. So I like Ben Johnson. I like that move of them hiring him. That was the number one coach that was out there. That's what they needed to do. And even if it doesn't work, I think it was still the right move for the Bears to go after Ben Johnson. He was the big name guy. That's what they got to do. You got to go after the big name guy. Sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's just the way it is. But I think the Bears will be pretty good this year. And I, of course, if you watched the last show, I had them as one of my hot takes going to the NFC Championship game in a very similar season that the Commanders had last year. You know, coming sort of out of nowhere, not a lot of people expecting too much from them, although I do think the Bears have a little bit more expectations than the Commanders did last year, going into this year, of course. But the next one that I have on this list is most likely coach to get fired during the season, and I have Bill Callahan of the Tennessee Titans. You could also make the argument for Brian Daboll of the Giants, depending on how the Russell Wilson thing goes, and whether or not they decide to draft a quarterback in the first round, despite the fact that they just signed Jameis Winston and Russell Wilson to fill out that quarterback room. Don't think they're going to go quarterback in the first round based on what they did. So, you know, that's the Giants. So I think it's a possibility the Giants could fire Brian Daboll if it starts to kind of snowball at the beginning of the year. But I think most likely would be Bill Callahan, just because the Titans, if you take a look at that team overall, I don't think there is much there for them to be very good this year. I mean, they will most likely draft Cam Ward, but Cam Ward was good in college, but we don't know what he's going to be like when he gets to the NFL. He's an unproven commodity. You know, until he laces him up and actually goes out onto the field in a regular season NFL game, we're not going to know how good he's going to be. It's very likely, well, not very likely, but it's very possible that he could end up being a bust and not be very good. Now, it's also very possible that he can come in and play sort of like how C.J. Stroud had his first year and could light the league up and be very, very good and make that team one of the surprises of the year. But I don't see it happening because I don't like the rest of that team. I don't think there's enough around that team to really do much. Now, they're in a pretty easy division, but the Texans are the class of that division, so they're going to have to get past them, even though the Texans, I think, regressed a little bit last year. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think they play much better than they did last year this coming season, and it's just going to be tough for the Titans head coach Bill Callahan to keep his job because of another reason is the fact that they have a brand new GM this year in Tennessee, a GM who did not hire Bill Callahan. So I think that it won't take much if they start to look like they're going to have another season in which they're, you know, drafting near the top of the draft. I think you could see Bill Callahan get the axe, especially with a new GM. If they had the same GM, maybe he'd be safe for another year. But I think with that new GM, he's probably not going to tolerate too much failure, and he's going to want to just hit the ground running and try and get a good team fielded. So Callahan could be a scapegoat, or he could be a good reason why they, you know, end up losing. But most likely, the next one, the most likely quarterback to get benched mid-season. Now, this one has two answers just because there is a quarterback competition, I think, in Indianapolis, and that is the two quarterbacks, Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones. I think no matter who is named the starter, either one of those guys will end up being benched in the middle of the season because of poor play. Because I don't believe in Anthony Richardson. As a Gator fan, I watched him in college, never thought that he was going to be a lights-out quarterback. Sure, he has all the physical tools and the athleticism and all of that. He has all of those things, but he cannot read the field well. He's not good under pressure. If he gets an interception or two on his record, he gets in his head, and that just snowballs, you know. But I've never really been the biggest fan of Anthony Richardson as a quarterback. I've never thought that he was worth as high as the coach drafted him. I thought they could have gotten a lot better players at that pick that they had, because they were fifth, if I remember correctly. They had the 5th overall pick when they snagged him from Florida, but I didn't agree with that. Still don't agree with them. And they've benched him several times since drafting him. You know, they themselves, I don't think, believe in him fully. That's why they went and got Daniel Jones to compete with him. So that's that one. The last one I have, we'll make this real quick so not to drag this segment out too much, but most likely player to win comeback player of the year, I have Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, we all know he spent a good chunk of the year last year in Germany dealing with that injury and trying to get second opinions and all of that, and was, unable to really do much this year in terms of on-field productivity. He got in a couple games, but he wasn't very, effective because he was hurt all year. Only had like 200 yards total for the entire year. But this is still an incredible running back, and he just had a year that was just bogged down by a ton of injuries and other things. And I think he's going to be motivated this year to come back and play better. And I think he's going to have a pretty solid season, and he'll probably win Comeback Player of the Year. So those are my superlatives. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any disagreements or anything like that, or one that maybe I forgot and you want to add on there, definitely let me know, and I'll shout it out here if I see it in the comments there. So before we get into our next segment of the show, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we're going to be right back right after this, and we're going to get into some top 5, starting with running backs and then moving on to edge rushers later in the show. So stick around. We'll be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. Before we get into our next segment here, I just want to give you guys a quick reminder that if you have any questions or any comments that you want to shout out in the super chat, just go ahead and hit the super chat on YouTube or on GSMCsports.net. If you have any tips, donations that you want to leave, you can go ahead and hit that website as well. Otherwise, any comments or questions, always greatly appreciated. So if you have any, definitely write them in the super chat or in the comments on YouTube, and we will try and get to them as soon as we can. So let's go ahead and get into the rest of the show here. Next segment that I have is top 5 running backs in the NFL. Now, I know probably the top 2 on this list are not going to really surprise too many people given last year's set of circumstances, but let's dive in. Number 5, I have Jonathan Taylor of the Colts, and he obviously has been consistently good for a number of years now. Last year's stats, he played 14 games, had about 303 total carries, just over 1,400 yards rushing. That's good for about a 4.7 yards per carry average. Also had 11 touchdowns and 1 receiving touchdown. And he did have 1 fumble that he lost, but overall, pretty solid numbers for Jonathan Taylor. The 1 fumble that he lost, if you remember, was against Denver a little bit later in the year when they were actually in control of that game, and the Broncos needed to win, and the Colts needed to win too for playoff positioning. And they were getting ready to go up by multiple scores. Jonathan Taylor had an easy walk-in touchdown because he had a nice long run that led him to that. And right as he got across the line, he does what, for some reason, so many other players have done in the past, and that is let go of the ball before you cross the plane. I see it happen. I've seen it happen. Everybody's seen it happen a number of years now, and I will never, ever understand why players keep doing that. Like, hold on to the ball until you get in the end zone. If you have to hold on to it until you give it to the ref, until the ref asks you for the ball, then do that. Just don't drop the ball. I mean, that just boggles my mind every time I see it from players in the NFL, and it just continues to happen too. You would think people would be more, adamant about holding onto the ball and not giving it away, because then it can roll into the end zone and then it's a touchback going the other way. So never understand that. But Jonathan Taylor, although he is a really great running back, he's top 5 in my opinion. That was a boneheaded move that he made. Probably the worst play he made all year. Of course, it was just one play. He still had a good year overall, but that was a costly play because that changed the whole momentum of that game. And but Jonathan Taylor is still a very, very good running back. So make no mistake there. He's the best player the Colts have by far. That's Michael Pittman Jr. Maybe you could make an argument for him, but Jonathan Taylor is really the whole thing. He's the straw that stirs the drink. In other words, Jonathan Taylor is their offense entirely. So they lose him, they really have no shot. So I have Jonathan Taylor at number 5. Number 4 is a guy that we just mentioned as most likely to win Comeback Player of the Year, and that is Christian McCaffrey. And obviously he didn't have much stats last year because he was hurt all year, but the previous year he was in the running for MVP, and I personally thought he should have won MVP over who actually did win it was Lamar Jackson. I'm not saying Lamar Jackson's a bad quarterback. He certainly deserved MVP this year, even though he didn't win it. But that particular year that Lamar won MVP, he didn't have the numbers to be an MVP, in my opinion. Christian McCaffrey had those numbers. He had well over 20 touchdowns total in terms of rushing and receiving. He had over 1,000 yards. He did everything. He caught the ball. He ran the ball. He was very, very productive. And again, he was snake bitten by injuries last year, but I think he's going to come back just as well as he had been playing before that injury that cost him most of the year, if not all of the year. I think he's going to come back and play a lot better this year. He's going to be extra motivated with all of the nonsense that he had to, deal with last year with all of the injuries and everything. But I really like Christian McCaffrey. I've always thought he was a very good running back, very dynamic type of running back because he can do a number of different things. He's not just a home run hitter. He's elusive. He can actually run pretty good routes for a running back, and he's got good hands for a running back, catching the ball out of the backfield and all that. But, obviously he's got great vision, which is what you need. And he doesn't really fumble much either, which is another, very, very good attribute to have if you're a running back. So Christian McCaffrey is my number 4 right there. So number 3, I have Jahmyr Gibbs of the Lions. He is one of the two-headed monster at running back that they do have in Detroit. You could even make the argument that their other running back, David Montgomery, deserves some recognition on a list like this too. It's just I don't think he's top 5. I think he's definitely up there around top 10 range in running backs, and that's a two-headed monster they have in Detroit. But Jahmyr Gibbs is the star when it comes to running back in Detroit. He had, obviously David Montgomery had a few injuries last year, so he missed some time, but Jahmyr Gibbs started all 17 games, had 1,400 yards, had a 5.6 yards per carry average, 16 rushing touchdowns, and he also added 4 receiving touchdowns as well. So 20 total touchdowns, and he also had 517 receiving yards too. So that's almost 2,000 yards from scrimmage that Jahmyr Gibbs had last year. So he was absolutely effective. That Detroit offense entirely was very good, but if you can stand out on an offense like that, you're doing something right, and Jahmyr Gibbs is definitely that guy. He's elusive. He's a great runner, great vision. He's explosive, very fast. If he gets out into the open field, it's very hard to take him down just because of his speed. He's an absolute weapon for that Detroit Lions offense for sure, and I really like what Jahmyr Gibbs has done so far for the Lions. And number 2, I know we're kind of getting through this kind of quickly here, but number 2 I have is Derrick Henry for the Ravens. Like I said, these top 2 shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I think you can all guess who number 1 is, of course, too. But number 2, I have Derrick Henry. His first season as a Baltimore Raven, and it was not, anything to sneeze at all. He was just a shade under 2,000 yards rushing on 325 carries, 5.9 yards per carry average, 16 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns. He was fantastic. He had one fumble that he lost that was against Pittsburgh early in the year, but he was solid, in terms of taking care of the ball from that point on. And he was one of those guys that can just absolutely kill you if you don't get him at the line of scrimmage. That's the thing with Derrick Henry, how strong of a runner he is. Once he gets that full head of steam going, there's virtually nobody that's going to stop him. He's just going to bowl through whoever it is that tries to tackle him in the secondary. He's a mismatch for anybody in the secondary because of how big he is and how fast he is. He's deceptively fast for a guy that size, too. You don't realize how quick he is until he gets out into the middle or gets out into the open field, and he's just running by defenders, and they can't do anything about it. When he's playing like that, he's one of the most effective running backs in the game. You could even make the argument that when he's playing at his peak, at his absolute best, he could, give Saquon Barkley a good run for his money in terms of who the better running back is. I think Saquon Barkley obviously is the better running back, and we'll get to that in a second. But Derrick Henry is no slouch. He's been doing this since he was in Tennessee. He's been doing it since he was in Yulee High School, before he was drafted or before he was picked up and recruited by Alabama, before ultimately being drafted by the Titans. He's been doing this his entire football playing career, all the way back at high school. He's just been bigger than everybody else in every level of the game. So he uses his stature, his physical strength, of course, to be as dominant of a runner as he is, but he is also deceptively fast too. And if you can get those kind of, that kind of combination in a running back, it's deadly. It's a very deadly combination. He is a very good running back, and it's almost unfair that he's on a team like the Ravens, who already ran the ball so effectively before Derrick Henry got there. I mean, Lamar Jackson had almost 1,000 yards rushing by himself last year, and that was with Derrick Henry with almost 2,000 yards. So they ran for over 3,000 yards when you compare the other running backs and everything. That as a team, they ran for over 3,000 yards, which is pretty crazy in today's NFL, especially with it being a much more pass-happy, pass-oriented type of league nowadays. Even though last year I would say is kind of a resurgence, a revolution of sorts of the running back position, because there was a number of guys, and just these guys on this list right here just shows you how great of a season it was for running backs. Much like the previous season was for backup quarterbacks, that's what it was this year for running backs. You really see, like with a couple years ago with the backup quarterbacks, with all of the guys that were having success being backups, you started to kind of see the importance of having a quality backup, or at least a serviceable backup, so that it could keep your team afloat and still give your team a chance to do things if you lose your starter. And now last year put a lot of emphasis on how important it is to have a strong run game in order to be successful. The Eagles are a perfect example of that, and the Ravens are a perfect example of that. They run the ball really, really well, and they usually win a lot more games than they don't. Because of that, because they're able to control the ball, and they're able to just essentially just play keep away from any defense, especially a defense that struggles against stopping the run. So, Derrick Henry was fantastic all year long, and it continued into the playoffs before they ultimately got knocked out by Buffalo. But really like Derrick Henry. He's number 2, and for a guy that's in his 30s, it's very impressive what he's able to do, because that's typically when you start seeing running backs start to decline a little bit. But Derrick Henry doesn't show any signs of decline. If anything, it seems like he has gotten better since going to Baltimore, which is a scary thought. And we'll see how he bounces back this year from the Ravens falling short of their ultimate goal of the Super Bowl. So we'll see how he does in year 2 in Baltimore. Moving on to the number 1 running back, it is no surprise to anybody that Saquon Barkley takes this spot. He, of course, was just a game away from breaking Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing yards record. If he would have played in that final game, which was a meaningless game, because they had already established their seeding and all of that, so he didn't need to play. But if he did play, he probably would have broken the record. But at the same time, there would always be that asterisk next to his record, because Eric Dickerson had that record and got that record in fewer games than Saquon Barkley. Even if Saquon were to get it in 16 games, it would still have been less games than Eric Dickerson played, because they have increased the amount of games that the NFL have played during the season over the course of the past few years. So his numbers: 345 carries, 2,005 rush yards, had a 5.8 yards per carry average, 13 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns. And of course, he had a very good playoff run as well. He didn't do much in the Super Bowl. The Chiefs actually did a pretty good job keeping him contained, which is not an easy thing to do. Saquon Barkley is a very good running back, best running back in the league. But I'm excited to see what he might do in year 2 as well, with everybody. Surely they will be planning heavily. Whenever it's Eagles week, the teams will be planning heavily on how to stop Saquon Barkley. That's what you have to do with the Eagles, is first you have to stop Saquon Barkley in order to have any chance. If you can do that, then you can, start going on to other parts of the Eagles offense. But Jalen Hurts is also a very good quarterback, and so is that receiver room too. They're all very good. So it's just a talented team overall. So Saquon Barkley fits in well with the Eagles and that really, really good offensive line that they have. It's a night and day difference between them and the Giants when he was still, showing out and having great games with New York. He was by far their best player, and the Giants decided to bet on Daniel Jones, who is also no longer on the team now. So it was a rough year for the Giants last year, with the Saquon stuff and the Daniel Jones stuff and just all of that, the hard knock stuff. It just wasn't a good year for the Giants, and Saquon lifting the Super Bowl trophy at the end of the year was just an icing on the cake for Saquon, but a nail in the coffin of the Giants in that season. That was just one extra gut punch when their season was already over. So, those are my top 5 picks. I think it's a pretty solid list, I think. Jonathan Taylor at 5, Christian McCaffrey at 4, Jahmyr Gibbs at 3, and Derrick Henry at 2, and Saquon at 1. I think that's a pretty solid list. I think most people would agree with that list that these guys, you could probably throw in Josh Jacobs there too for the Packers. He's a pretty solid running back as well, and we'll see what Ashton Genty does and all these other good running backs that are coming out in the rookie draft class this coming season. So there's a lot of good running backs coming out. So we'll see if anybody else starts to make their way close to this list as well. So that's it for that list. Before we go into our next list, which is in our next segment when we're covering edge rushers, I'm just going to take another break real quick. It'll just be a couple minutes, and then we're going to be right back, and we're going to talk about some edge rushers. And I'm sure this will be a talking point from a lot of people based on my list. So let's go ahead and take this break, and we'll be right back right after this.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome back to the show. We're going to get right into our third segment of the day. We're going to do top 5 edge rushers in the NFL. And this has always been a point of conversation for me amongst other fans of the NFL when I talk about best pass rushers in the league, because I have my own opinions and they differ from some other people's opinions, particularly 2 particular guys that are edge rushers. And we'll get to that here in a second. But let's just go ahead and get right into the list here. Number 5, I have Max Crosby of the Las Vegas Raiders. I always feel like saying the Oakland Raiders. I don't think I'll ever get over that because they're the Oakland Raiders to me. They're not the Vegas Raiders, but it is what it is. But I have Max Crosby, 22 sacks in the last 2 years. 22 sacks in the last 2 years for Max Crosby. He has 59.5 total career sacks. Obviously just signed a pretty big, massive deal for the Raiders in the offseason to keep him there, along with the new head coaching staff and, new offense that they have with Geno Smith and Pete Carroll as the head coach. But Max Crosby, there was talk that he could potentially go somewhere else in the offseason, but I personally don't I mean, obviously it's not going to happen because he signed the deal, but before he signed that deal, there was that rumor that maybe he could, be traded somewhere else, maybe to Detroit, who were in need of another edge rusher outside of Aiden Hutchinson, but didn't actually end up happening. And I'm kind of glad that it didn't, because I feel like Max Crosby is a Raider through and through. I couldn't imagine him on any other team, and he's definitely top 5. When you're talking about the Raiders, every time you go up against the Raiders, that's usually the first name that you circle is, okay, we need to get an eye on Max Crosby. We need to find a way to shut him down so he doesn't wreck our, offensive game plan, because he's absolutely capable of doing that. Last year, he didn't have a ton of sacks. He only had, I think it was like about 4.5 sacks, something like that last year. Or maybe I'm getting my years mixed up, because one of the last 2 years, he only had about 4 sacks or so. But he typically is right around the range of about 7 to 10 sacks. But he does more than just, sack the quarterback. He's a good run stopper as well. And he's just good at, getting that pressure. A lot of stats that you don't see on the stat sheet, or a lot of things that he does you don't see on the stat sheet, I should say. So I think he's definitely one of those guys that's in that top tier list of edge rushers. He could drastically improve your defensive line no matter who he ends up going to or whatever the case. But I think he's going to end up ending his career with the Raiders, which I think is rightfully so, because he just seems like a Raider to me. And it just would be weird to see him in any other color. I would love to see him in the black and gold, of course, but he's a Raider too, so there's kind of that old history. It's like, do you really want a Raider in the Steelers building, with all that history? But, that's more for the older people who watched the Steelers back in the day. They've always had been Raiders rivals, but they don't really play much anymore. So, it's not really as much of a rivalry as it used to be, of course. But Max Crosby, number 5. So I don't want to get too far off track here. Number 4, I have Micah Parsons of the Cowboys. He was drafted in 2021, has 52.5 career sacks, and has had at least 12 sacks every single year. He is obviously a very, very good edge rusher. He's incredibly explosive, a very, very fast guy. He can wreck a game. He can take over a game. I've seen him do it a number of times against teams. He will just completely take over the game. And the Cowboys, they need as much of that as they can get, because with Overshown getting hurt last year, and he was actually really, really showing some really good signs that he could be a very good player to pair with Micah Parsons. But the other thing with the Cowboys is, are they going to sign Micah Parsons, because he is one of those guys that's going to be up for a contract here soon. And with Myles Garrett getting his monster deal, and Trey Hendrickson trying to get a deal, and TJ Watt expected to get an extension at some point in the offseason, you would think Micah Parsons he's getting close to being due, and he's going to want a pretty good amount of money, most likely, to stay in Dallas, or maybe he moves on somewhere else. But with the way he talked about Dexter Lawrence when Dexter Lawrence left for Seattle, kind of makes me think that maybe he'll stay in Dallas for the majority, or if not his entire career. But who knows? He could have just been saying that to get people to like his podcast that, he has. So who knows? Money always talks. So if another team ever offered him more, I'm sure he would be the first person that would want to go, despite giving Dexter Lawrence a lot of grief for what he said about the Cowboys. Micah Parsons would probably do the same thing if he was offered Myles Garrett money, for example, to play somewhere else. But Micah Parsons is still very, very good. Drafted from Penn State, of course, who are very good at creating, these big-time defensive players, at least, recently with, of course, Abdul Carter, who's sporting that same number 11 when he was at Penn State. He's coming out, and he's one of the best edge rushers in the draft. He's actually considered by a lot of people arguably the best player overall in this draft. And he is at edge rusher. Titans were talking about maybe getting him. Even the Browns were talking about possibly drafting him. I've seen that floated around in some mock drafts too, which would be an interesting pairing to have Abdul Carter and Myles Garrett there too. But yeah, so Micah Parsons I have at number 4. I think that's pretty solid for him. Number 3, I have Trey Hendrickson. He led the league last year with 17.5 sacks, and that is actually his career high, which he also had the year before. So that's 2 consecutive years where he's had 17.5 sacks. So obviously that's very, very good. He was drafted by the Saints back in 2017, had 77 career sacks so far in his career. And he's, of course, trying to work on a deal with the Bengals to stay there after they had, of course, re-signed T. Higgins and Jamar Chase as well. So he would be another domino that would need to fall for the Bengals to just keep that core together. But Hendrickson would be wanted by just about every team in the league, I would think, because he's that good. He's a great edge rusher, can get to the quarterback, of course, but he can stop the run very well, too. Just the problem with the Bengals is they don't have a great defense outside of Trey Hendrickson. He's by far their best player on defense. So, he gets a lot of the shine and rightfully so, because he's the one that's always making plays for the Bengals. And if they want to get to where they need to get to, which is a Super Bowl, which is what their goal is, they need to keep Trey Hendrickson somehow, because if they lose him to an already ailing defense, that defense is just going to continue to give up big plays like they did last year. So lock Trey Hendrickson down. He's one of the best edge rushers in the game for sure. So you definitely want to lock him down. And he's number 3 on my list. Now, let's get to the 2 that I really, really wanted to talk about here. And number 2 I have, and I'm sure a lot of people will disagree, and they'll probably have this flip-flopped, and maybe they will have a completely different list altogether. But I have Myles Garrett at number 2 for Cleveland. Drafted by the Browns in 2017, he has 102.5 career sacks, 14 sacks the last 2 seasons, and of course he won Defensive Player of the Year back in 2023. Now, I feel like I'm pretty harsh on Myles Garrett, because I do believe that he is a great defensive player and will probably go down in the Hall of Fame by the end of his career. I have no bones about that. Definitely believe that that's the case. He's that good of a player. I just have never thought that he was better than the guy who's sitting at number 1, and which is TJ Watt. So instead of just doing 2 and 1, we're just going to combine these 2, because this is a comparison that gets made a lot between these 2 guys, is whether or not Myles is the better edge rusher or best edge rusher in the league, and TJ Watt not so much. The only thing that's really hurting TJ Watt is that he has had injuries in recent years. Myles Garrett hasn't really had to deal with too many injuries over the course of his career. He's been dinged up a few times, but nothing really major. And though TJ Watt has never missed an entire season before, he's missed a lot of games, and the Steelers don't do very well when he doesn't play. And Myles Garrett, of course, the thing with Myles Garrett that I personally have an issue with is he tends to fade towards the end of the year. Like the year that he won Defensive Player of the Year, I don't think he should have won Defensive Player of the Year. You could call that me being biased, call that me being a homer, whatever you want to call it. But TJ Watt had better numbers in every single statistical category over Myles Garrett. He had more sacks, more forced fumbles, more tackles for loss, more tackles overall, more interceptions. He did everything better than Myles Garrett. But TJ Watt, for some reason, gets consistently hated on by whoever it is who comes up with these, awards or votes on these awards. It's a popularity contest as far as Defensive Player of the Year. And TJ Watt has been snubbed a number of times for that award. He leads the league in sacks just about every year. I mean, seemingly. He's led the league in sacks in 3 different seasons, just to be, exact. And that is more than any other player in NFL history has ever done. And he is also has tied the record that Michael Strahan set back in the day of the single season sack record of 22.5 sacks. He did that in 2021 when he won his only Defensive Player of the Year award. But he did that in less games than Michael Strahan did as well, because TJ missed a few games that particular season due to injury and really should have broken the record in that game against Baltimore, but he had a sack that was called back because of a penalty on the defense. Otherwise, he would have had the record, so he is an absolute monster. And there is a reason why he gets chipped and double and triple teamed on every single play, is because you have to. because if you don't, he will eat you alive, and he will eat your offensive line alive. That's TJ Watt, healthy, is better than any other rusher in this league. And I know a lot of people will maybe not a lot of people, but some people will disagree with me there because people have this love affair with Myles Garrett, thinking that he's somehow better than TJ Watt, and he's just not. I'm sorry, he's just not. Myles Garrett is a tremendous defensive player, tremendous edge rusher, and any team would be incredibly lucky to have him. No disrespect to Myles Garrett at all for his ability to play on the field. He's an incredible player, but TJ Watt is a better edge rusher. Just look at the stats. That's all you got to do. Look at the stats. He is the better player, period. You know, last year was kind of a down year for TJ Watt, and he still managed 11.5 sacks. That's a down year for TJ Watt. There are a lot of defensive players in the NFL that will go their entire career and not have a season in which they have 11.5 sacks. That's a down year for TJ. You know, he played most of the year, but he didn't have a great year, admittedly, and this was one of the few years that he did not get snubbed for Defensive Player of the Year. Pat Surtain won it, and I think he deserved to win it because TJ just didn't have the numbers last year. But if you're talking about overall body of work, TJ Watt's the better player, period. You know, the only thing that's a knock on TJ is injuries and the fact that he has not won a playoff game, but that is not his fault. He is the best player on that team and has been since he became the starter. He's been the best player on that team. Best player on that defense for sure, but I would argue that he's the best player on the team simply because you look at the record when he's not on the field. The Steelers don't win many games. I think they've won one game with TJ not on the field in his entire career, and they just have an incredibly bad record when he's not playing. And that shows you how important of a player he is and why he should be defensive MVP, essentially, you know, because he's the most valuable player on that defense, which is essentially what Defensive Player of the Year is, right? You know, it's most valuable player on that particular defense. But I think the reason why Myles Garrett won it that particular year in 2023 was because for some reason people like Myles Garrett more than TJ Watt. I don't know what it is. It's strange to me as to why that is, but you know, I think TJ's the better edge rusher, period, you know, regardless of what all the pundits on ESPN or Pro Football Talk or Pro Football Focus, you know, who have those wonderful pass rush win rate thing that they base everything on, and they think the best player in the NFL is a guy who almost gets to the quarterback but doesn't, over a guy that does get to the quarterback. So I don't want to vent too much because I can go all day talking about that particular subject because it just gets under my skin whenever I see that. But those are my list. Myles Garrett, number 2, TJ, number 1, and, of course, rounding out the rest of the 5, Max Crosby at 5, Micah Parsons at 4, Trey Hendrickson at 3. So that's my list for edge rushers. When we come back, we're going to do something a little bit different, something that we have not done on this show before, but is a way that I am kind of trying to get more people involved in topics on the show. You know, if you have a question that you want to get heard, if you don't get a chance to do it in the super chat, you can always, you know, hit up one of these videos or one of the shorts that I do and do a mailbag or, you know, some questions that we'll answer in a mailbag. I'd like to do this once a week if we get enough questions every week. Of course, you know, there'll be a backup plan as always if we don't get enough questions, and I'll try and touch on some of the questions, you know, week by week, depending on, you know, what we get and all that. So before we get into that mailbag segment, though, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to get right into it. So just stick with us. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
All right, guys, welcome back to the show. This next segment, like I said, is a little bit different. We were originally going to do this yesterday, like I said, but I had some technical issues where I lost a good chunk, or actually all of the prep work that I did for this particular show. I lost all of that yesterday for some glitch that happened on my computer. It's just unfortunate, but every Wednesday is what I want to do with this mailbag segment, but since we missed last night's episode, we're going to do Thursday mailbag. So I have a number of questions that I got. I just basically put out a flyer for different social medias, so I got some friends, some family members even, came in with a comment, and then just some other people as well added in with some questions. Just a little way just to kind of keep you guys, engaged with the show as much as possible. And I thought it would be kind of a good segment to have, especially with how slow the news cycle is in the NFL right now. So first question comes from a friend of mine, comes from Dan, asking, how will Deebo Samuel help the Washington Commanders this year? Well, I think that he is going to be a very good player for them. I know he hasn't necessarily had the best couple of years. He had his lowest receiving yard total since 2022 last year, when he had about 670 yards receiving. He dealt with some injuries here and there too, but he's still 29 years old. So, he's still not an old wide receiver, but he's not young either. But I still think he's a good route runner, and he'll have plenty of opportunities with Washington having Terry McLaurin there, taking a lot of pressure off of Deebo Samuel. But at the same time, you're going to have to, attribute some or focus some defensive attention on Deebo Samuel, because he still is capable of making big plays. And with a guy like Jaden Daniels to potentially benefit from this, I think it's just a great signing for the Commanders. They didn't have to give much up for him. I just like what the Commanders are doing in the offseason altogether. But I like Deebo Samuel. I thought that was a very underrated move, and I think he can really help them, because he can, he's not going to be your number one receiver. They're not asking him to be that. So if he can just be somewhat of the guy that he was a couple years ago when he was putting up 1,400 yards receiving with the 49ers, then I think they can really, really use him. Plus, they have good offensive minds in Washington, with Cliff Kingsbury still holding on for the offense coordinator position, and Dan Quinn, of course, coming back for his second year. He's more of a defensive guy, but, he's still a good coach, good motivator, and will definitely help Jaden Daniels. I think it's a better situation for Deebo as well, because he wanted to get out of San Francisco. The Brock Purdy connection with him, it just didn't really seem like it fit too much with what he was trying to do. But I really like the fit in Washington. I think he's going to be very good for them. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So that's the first of the mailbag. So the next question is Steelers-centric. I got this question actually from my dad, and I admittedly had to kind of adjust the question, because we can't really have some of the language used on this show, but that's just out of frustration, and I get it, because I've been there. We go back and forth on why we think the Steelers are not very good anymore. But the question is, why have the Steelers not prioritized the future of the team by trying to get a young quarterback instead of older quarterbacks such as Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers? And you could even throw Ben Roethlisberger on there too, because of the last couple seasons that Ben was in Pittsburgh, he was very much a shell of his former self, and they really should have been planning for the future back then, as opposed to being in the situation that they're in now. So why they don't prioritize the future of the team, I will give you 2 words why. Mike Tomlin. That's the reason why. Mike Tomlin is the type of guy that wants to win each season. He's not a big picture guy. He looks at, when he goes into a season, when he goes into every game, he's looking at, what can I do to win this year? What can I do to win this week? He doesn't think about, let's talk about next year. What's going to happen when we lose our veteran quarterback? He's always of the mindset of, we'll worry about that when we get there. But you cannot live in the NFL like that, especially not now. You need to focus on the most important position in all of sports, really, in all of football for sure, but in all of sports, you can make the argument that the quarterback is the most important, most vital position, because if you lose a key player at that position, it tears your whole season apart usually. And you become, if you're a team like, say, the Ravens or the Eagles or something like that, or the Chiefs, and you lose your starting quarterback, you go from a Super Bowl contender to fringe playoff team at best. That's how important the quarterback position room is. And it's insulting to me as a Steeler fan that the Steelers are actually wasting their time catering to Aaron Rodgers and waiting for his decision. And he's a 42-year-old quarterback. This signing, if it happens, will do absolutely nothing for you. All it will do is maybe you'll get to 9-8 and 10-7, but guess what? You're going to lose in the first round of the playoffs again. It's just what's going to happen. This doesn't do anything to further, your future or make your fans feel like you're going in the right direction. There's virtually no hope in Pittsburgh amongst the fan base, right now. And I follow a lot of beat writers and things of that nature, and even most of them don't understand why the Steelers are wasting their time going after Aaron Rodgers. It is only the national media, like the ESPNs and the Fox Sports and all of those kinds of guys, that think that Aaron Rodgers is the second coming of Joe Montana or something like that, that he's going to just go into whatever team that he goes into and automatically they're a Super Bowl contender. They are not. He is not the same guy he was even 3 years ago before his Achilles injury. He's not that guy anymore. And the thing that drives me nuts about this whole situation is that at the end of last year, Mike Tomlin went out of his way in his end of season conference to emphasize the need for a mobile quarterback in the NFL to be successful. So you have that need, and guess what? You had a guy who was a mobile quarterback on the roster, or he wasn't technically, I guess, on the roster in the offseason, but you had him in your building last year, and you let him go to the Jets for a 2-year, $40 million contract, but you want to bring Aaron Rodgers in for probably more than that for a 42-year-old quarterback, a guy who's almost 20 years older than Justin Fields was. Justin Fields, outside of Lamar Jackson, you could make the argument that Justin Fields is one of the more dynamic running quarterbacks in the entire NFL outside of Lamar. And you say you have a need for mobile quarterbacks, and then you let the most mobile quarterback that you've ever had, you let him go for peanuts. And you want to bring in an old man who can't move, who's playing on one good leg with his Achilles. Those Achilles, yeah, sure, he played a whole game or whole season last year, but he's 42 years old. Where is the guarantee that he's going to play an entire season this year, especially in the AFC North? He's not going to survive in the AFC North. This is not the AFC East. This is not the NFC North when he was there. When he was there, it was the Packers, sometimes the Vikings, and then the Bears and Lions were trash. That's his entire career was spent in Green Bay. And then he goes to the Jets and, has a bad year because it's the Jets. The Jets always have bad years because they're the Jets. But, now he wants to come to Pittsburgh, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why he wants to come either, because he's not going to win a Super Bowl here. It's not like he wants one last shot at a Super Bowl. The Steelers are not one quarterback away from a Super Bowl. And if he thinks that, he's got a whole other thing coming. And most of the fan base, they don't even want him. So I just question why he would even want to come to Pittsburgh, because he has to know that most people in Pittsburgh don't want him there except for Mike Tomlin. This is a Mike Tomlin decision. I don't care what anyone says. The only reason the Steelers are even looking at Aaron Rodgers is because Mike Tomlin likes Aaron Rodgers. He's buddy-buddy with him. He likes him. He's a fan of him. He's a fan of Aaron Rodgers when Aaron Rodgers was lighting up the league and winning 4 MVPs. He ain't that guy anymore, Mike. He's just not. So, why are you wasting your time? Roll with Mason Rudolph. Draft a guy in the 4th or 5th round, see if you got something with him, maybe trade for another guy to fill out that quarterback room, and then focus on getting your future quarterback next season. That's what you should do. This Aaron Rodgers nonsense is exactly that. It's nonsense. and they need to move on from this because it's getting to be ridiculous at this point that we're still waiting on this guy and we're still allowing ourselves to wait on this guy as a Steelers fan or Steelers organization. They're willing to just sit and wait for a 42-year-old quarterback who might end up even retiring. And then what are you going to do if he retires? You just wasted this entire offseason waiting on an old guy who never even wanted to come here. So it's an incredible lack of focus in the front office. They want to get, it's not just that quarterback too that they do this. They do this on defense too. Take a look at Darius Slay. That screams Patrick Peterson all over again to me, because Darius Slay, he's older than Patrick Peterson was when Patrick Peterson signed here. It's Tomlin and this organization's just maddening need to get old guys who used to be good in their heyday and think just because he's got that name, that means he's going to put forth the same tape on field that he did in his prime. And that's just not the way the NFL works, man. It's just not. And they're never going to go anywhere until they get a whole new mindset in there, which this just leads to me wanting Mike Tomlin gone, because they're going to be in the same boat each and every year until they have a new mindset, a mindset that wants to build the team and knows that it's going to take more than a year. You don't just go get some guy who used to be good in his prime and think he's going to just magically recover the fountain of youth, in your building. Russell Wilson didn't do it. Ben Roethlisberger didn't do it in his last 2 seasons. What makes you think that Aaron Rodgers, who was older than all of them, is going to do it? He's just not. I just don't like it. But I spent way too much time on that question, so I apologize. But I'll go through these next questions. Really, this one that I wanted to answer. What are your thoughts on the rule change that would move a touchback on kickoffs to the 35-yard line? Right now, it's at the 30-yard line. Back in the day, it used to come out to the 20, back when I was younger watching this league. But the league just seems to constantly cater to offensive players and offensive talent. And I get it. It sells tickets. I get all that. But how many rules are they going to make to hurt the defense? Because you're just essentially you're making kickers, their whole reasoning for this is they want to see more kickoff returns. Newsflash, there's not going to be more kickoff returns, because there's going to be more of an emphasis from kickers to just kick it out of the back of the end zone if they know that they're going to, end up getting, or maybe not. Let me reword that. Not the back of the end zone. They're going to want to do these pooch kicks, and it's not going to result in anything. It's not going to do anything but hurt the defense. And they've already have enough rules going on that hurt the defense. So why add another one? It's just they're making it almost impossible to play defense as it is. So now you're going to put your defense in a hole because your kicker kicked it out of the back of the end zone. So now, because of that, it's essentially a penalty. You're essentially making a touchback a penalty, because if you take a look at illegal formation or, illegal kick out of bounds, they get the ball at the 40-yard line after that penalty. That's a 5-yard difference from just a touchback. That you're essentially penalizing the team for kicking a touchback. I just think it's a stupid rule, and it doesn't need to be. They keep doing all these changes to the kickoffs, and it's not doing anything but just confusing people and frustrating the fan base, because it's just from them doing the dynamic kickoffs where nobody moves and it's just all weird like it was last year. Now they're trying to move up the touchback to the 35-yard line. You're essentially 15 yards away from midfield, 25 yards away from field goal range already as soon as you get the ball. So it's just not beneficial to defenses. You got to make it a little bit more fair. I mean, defenses can only do so much, especially with all the soft calls and pass interference calls that are routinely called each and every week. And every single week, we always have a segment somewhere on national TV where the refs are a problem in the NFL. The refs have screwed somebody, or the refs have cost this team the game. It's every single year, and it cannot be a good look for the NFL. But they do nothing to fix it. They just add more rules that confuse the refs, because there's way too many rules. Why do you think there's so many bad calls? Because they're looking for a million different things. And of course they're bound to get a few wrong, and they tend to get a few wrong. And it's this whole ref mess is just the NFL's problem. I don't even necessarily blame the refs, because they have a hard job. I get it. Sure, they make some pretty bad calls, but look at what they've got to go on. They've got hundreds of different rules that they have to follow. Some rules you don't even know until they pull it up in a game. They've got a lot of stuff that they have to study too. So it's a bad move from the NFL, period, in my opinion. So that's the Thursday mailbag. That segment went a little bit longer than I wanted it to. Kind of went on a little bit of a vent there when I talked about the Steelers. I tend to do that, and I need to watch that because I'm sure not everybody's a Steeler fan and wants to hear that. So, but regardless, it was a successful segment, I think. I thought it was a fun little thing to do, and looking forward to hopefully doing more of these Thursday or Wednesday mailbags. If you guys send in any questions or anything like that, we can answer them on air. That would be fun. So let's go ahead and take our final break. And when we come back, we're going to get into our final segment, switching gears a little bit. And we're going into college, and we're going to do some season outlooks. This time we're going to be doing the Florida Gators and what I think they might look at this coming season. So just stick with us, and we'll be right back right after this break. All right, guys, welcome on back to the show. We're in our final segment of tonight's show, and we're going to be doing some college football talk. We're going to be talking about the Florida Gators and their 2025 season outlook here in the College Corner. I have the Gators hopefully getting better and better this year. I think they're going to have a better team this year than they did last year. And last year, although it was an up and down season for the Gators, they started pretty bad. They did go on a 4-game win streak to end the year last year, and that was largely in part because of their quarterback who is returning for his sophomore season, DJ Lagway, leading the way. He was 6-0 as the Gators starter last year. Of course, he bounced in and out of the lineup with different injuries and all that. And plus, he was a freshman, so he wasn't the starter. But he started the last few games for the Gators, and they were on a 4-game win streak to end the year, got to a bowl game, won that. And taking a look at what they've done in the offseason so far, they've recruited pretty well at the wide receiver position. Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson both are near 5-star recruits coming out of high school in Gainesville and Tampa, respectively. I think Vernell Brown in particular is a good addition to a pretty solid receiver room overall. They did also pick up some transfer window or transfer portal guys like UCLA wide receiver J. Michael Sturdivant. They added him to the wide receiver room, so that'll be an improvement for the Gators overall. They returned 7 starters on offense as well as 8 on defense, and including offensive lineman and center, All-American center Jake Slaughter and left tackle Austin Barber, both returning to solidify that offensive line, which should be much better and is definitely the strength of this team overall. And they're going to need, they're going to need that going up against a pretty solid schedule, pretty tough schedule that they have this year. And it's usually the case anyway in the SEC, but in particular this year, there's a lot of really good teams out there in the SEC. On defense, they returned a trio of defensive linemen that combined got 16.5 sacks last year, and that is defensive end Tyreek Sapp, George Gums Jr., and Caleb Banks on that defensive line. And I think the defensive line it's been a big issue. They've that's whenever I watch the Florida Gator games as a fan, that's the one thing that I always, when I talk to a friend of mine who's also a Gator fan when we're watching the games, one thing that I always sticks out to me is the Gators typically always have a good defense. Has not been the case in recent years. That's really been their issue. A lot of the time when they had good defense, it was the offense that was the issue. The offense has since gotten better. Now the defense needs to, get to their end of the bargain as well and pick up their other end of the couch, as you say. So, the secondary also, they're returning 4 starters. That should be a pretty solid secondary overall. It should be an overall improved group on defense and on offense, but I really like what they could potentially do this year. This past season, they went 8-5 overall. So before, the games that DJ Lagway did not start or finish in, they were 2-5, and they were 6-0 in games that he did start in and finish in. So, he should be an improvement overall. They've got a whole new quarterback room. Graham Hurts is no longer there, of course. So they should be better offensively, and I really like what they could potentially have. I mean, now Billy Napier, he is, of course, the head coach in his 6th season. This might be the team that is probably the best on paper that he's had in his tenure. He hasn't had a great tenure in Florida, but not a lot of head coaches have had great tenure since the Tim Tebow days. Or you could maybe make the argument that back when Kyle Trask was there, playing really well, of course they went 11-1 one year under Kyle Trask, and they were good that year, but they weren't really, national title contenders, not serious ones anyway. So I think they got a long way to go before they get to that point. But DJ Lagway actually, and I learned this when I was doing research on other college segments a few weeks ago, but DJ Lagway has actually got the 5th best odds to win the Heisman. Now, obviously, that's super, super early because we're still in spring ball, spring training, and all that stuff. But the fact that he's up there, that just shows you his potential. He could potentially be, if everything works out and he ends up being the guy that people hope that he can be, the Gators can be very competitive in the SEC and the SEC East in particular. But they've got a lot of tough games coming up. Texas, of course, they're going to have to be going up against Arch Manning, and they're getting a lot of hype in the SEC. They should be the favorites in the SEC, Texas, that is. Georgia, of course, is always going to be a challenge, that Florida-Georgia rivalry every single year. World's largest cocktail party is what they used to call it, but they don't call it that anymore, I don't believe. But, that's always a tough game. Game against Tennessee in the Swamp later in the year, that's going to be tough as well. The game against LSU is also going to be tough. They've got a good quarterback situation, good offense there. And, of course, Brian Kelly, the head coach there, starting to really find his groove at LSU since coming there a few years ago. But I think they could get to about 9 or 10 wins overall this coming season. It's just going to kind of all depend on how DJ Lagway kind of comes along in his sophomore season. Showed a lot of promise in that freshman year. But he's got some wide receivers that he can throw to. Like I said, Dallas Wilson, Vernell Brown, those are 2 young guys that should come in and contribute pretty soon, or right away, or pretty close to right away, And with those 7 returning starters on offense and the 8 on defense, that just brings more continuity to that team and just keeps it more stable. You've got one of the best centers in the country in Jake Slaughter. The offensive line, like I said, should be very, very good this year. Their running back room is still pretty solid. They return a couple of guys that they had last year as well. So they should be solid there at that position. But we'll see what they do overall. SEC East is always a tough division to kind of crack, especially with these teams that are increasing, their talent over the years. Tennessee has always been a tough game for the Gators. Kentucky has usually been a pretty tough game in recent years for the Gators. Now, I'm not saying Kentucky is a world beater or anything like that, but it's still going to be a tough game. And also South Carolina. South Carolina is one of the best defensive teams in all of the SEC, and they should be just as good this year too. And that's going to be a team that's going to be hard to beat as well. So you got to think that's another team that they're going to have to get around at some point. if they want to get to where they want to get to, which of course is the SEC championship game. And I think that they can contend in the SEC East. Don't think that they'll win the SEC East. I just think there's too many good teams in that division. I think LSU probably won't win the West, but they'll compete in the West, I think. Georgia in the East Georgia and Tennessee, I think, are probably right up there too as being pretty competitive in that division as well. We'll see what they end up doing as the season goes along and everything. But this, I think, is a very pivotal year for Billy Napier and that coaching staff. They've got a solid team. They've gotten a pretty good recruiting class, one of the best in the country. They got a young quarterback that has shown great promise as a freshman, should improve this year. So at this point, you've got to see some significant improvement or significant signs of improvement if you're Billy Napier. Otherwise, you could potentially look at Billy Napier being out the door at the end of the year, and they're starting from scratch again, trying to cycle through all these coaches since Urban Meyer has just not really been, very productive. You've had guys like, Dan Mullen, who, of course, used to be the offensive coordinator when Urban Meyer was here, and that didn't really work out either. You've had a ton of other guys in there, and just hasn't really, they're not necessarily Ron Zook or anything like that for any of you guys who remember Ron Zook. That was an interesting era, to say the least, but they're no Steve Spurriers either. So, there's just been kind of a mixed bag of talent or lack of talent at the coaching position. I think Billy Napier is a decent coach. I'm not a Billy Napier guy. I'm not like a Billy Napier supporter. I want him to do well, obviously, because I'm a Gators fan, but I just don't think that he's ultimately the guy that's going to lead them to, say, a national championship or something like that. They're going to need to get better in a lot of other aspects before they start thinking about national championship. But I know there are some people in that building in this particular offseason or spring that are thinking playoffs or bust, really. I don't think that. I don't think the Gators are a playoff team this year. I think they could threaten to get into a playoff spot with this expanded playoff that college football has now. But I still don't think they're going to be, good enough. It's not that they're a bad team. I just think their schedule is too tough for them to be a playoff team this particular season. Maybe if DJ comes back for his junior year, maybe they have a better shot at making the playoffs then, because if that's the case, then that's 3 years of starting, 3 years of continuity, and you would think that they're probably going to return a couple of guys that are also returning this year if DJ ends up staying. If he ends up having a really good year this year and ends up staying, then they could really be in the running for a playoff spot and probably would start the season in the top 25 at least. And we'll see, what they decide or what they end up doing overall. But I have the Gators getting to about 9 wins. I think they can do 1 win better. Maybe take one of those tough games, like maybe that game against Tennessee in the Swamp. I like them there. It's going to be a tough matchup though with Tennessee and all the weapons that they have. But I think Tennessee probably that makes the most sense in terms of a game that they could win because it's in the Swamp and they've had success against Tennessee in the past. Now, I know all of those teams, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, all of those teams were in the playoffs last year. So it's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy for the Gators at all. And the Georgia game is always tough. Kirby Smart is a hell of a coach, one of the best in the SEC for sure. He's got multiple national championships for a reason. And, of course, he was an assistant at Alabama when they were winning national championships under Nick Saban. So he comes from a very good coaching tree, and he has proven to be a very good head coach himself. So that's going to be a tough game. Texas is going to be tough because of the Arch Manning hype and everything. It's going to be interesting to see Arch Manning overall in the SEC, too, as a starter. He played a couple games last year, when Quinn Ewers was out. But I think Arch Manning could potentially have a real future in the NFL, and this year's going to kind of go a long way in determining where he gets drafted. Now, he's going to probably get drafted pretty high simply because of the fact that he's a Manning. But if he backs that Manning name up with some quality play, he could end up being one of the first players taken in the draft next year. And there'll be a lot of teams that'll need quarterbacks, as they always are. Every year, there's always a few teams that do need them. So Steelers are one of them. Don't think that they're going to get Arch Manning because they're going to have to probably pick in the top 3 or something like that in order to get him. Otherwise, they can trade up and try and get him that way. But, so the SEC is scheduled to be very tough, and the Gators, they're going to have to get through it. If you want to be the best, you got to beat the best. That's just the way it is. And although the SEC is maybe not necessarily the conference that it once was, the Big Ten has seemed to catch them as being the best conference in football and college football right now. But that doesn't mean that the SEC doesn't have good teams. There's a number of good teams that I didn't even mention here. Vanderbilt can be, sneaky sometimes. They're never really in the running to do any kind of damage in the SEC, but they're just always that team that they're sneaky. If you go sleeping, especially if it's at Vandy, if you go in there sleeping, they could shock you and they could end up beating you. It's happened before, and they're just a scrappy team. So those games are going to be hard too. The only games that are probably not going to be hard are their, outside of conference or their outer conference division or outer conference matchups against teams that are paying them, or teams that are getting paid to come to the Swamp and get a beatdown, basically. You see it at the beginning of every college football season. That's why the first couple weeks of college football is not necessarily exciting matchups, because there are a lot of really, really good teams playing a lot of Division II schools and all that. And they're usually ended up being like 65-0 or something like that. So overall, I like where the Gators are heading. I think they're trending in the right direction. But I still got them about 9 wins this year and missing the playoffs. Obviously, 9 wins is a bowl game, so that's something. But, it's not the playoffs, which is where you want to be. So that's my Gators outlook. I'm going to continue the SEC in tomorrow's show as well. I'm probably going to talk a little bit about one of the Gators' biggest rivals, and that's the Georgia Bulldogs. They've got a little bit more positive outlook overall in terms of competing for a national championship and all that, but we'll get into that tomorrow when we talk about the Bulldogs. But that covers it for the show tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed doing the research and everything and getting this show together. Again, I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to do the show last night because of all the technical difficulties and everything that I was having, which is kind of unforeseen. So it was a little unfortunate. But I do thank you guys all for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast, though. We're, of course, as always, presented by the GSMC Sports Network on this show. And if you have a question or anything like that, of course, you can definitely comment, like I said. But your support does mean a lot to us. So just please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does help us out when you guys do that. It gets more eyes on our content, and everything. So we also invite you to follow us on all the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for all of those content and updates. And thank you once again, and have a wonderful night. We'll see you guys same time, same place tomorrow night. So have a good night, guys. We'll talk to you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't that